Who took that photo?
That's
for photography.
Today I'm going to talk about the 3 ways to control your camera that are going to get you great results when taking photos, no matter what camera you're using. What I'm talking about here is the exposure triangle made up of ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. These 3 camera and lens controls work together to regulate the amount of light that makes it to the light sensitive surface, aperture and shutter speed, and the sensitivity of that surface, film or digital ISO. If you stick to the guidelines I'll explain here, you're going to create some great images. And if you're not making great images right now, well, the principles here will help you to figure out why too. Let's get you covered, and we're going to do that in 10 minutes. Let's go. Let's start with ISO, and it's pretty much the first thing I set on a camera when I'm preparing to take a photo. ISO stands for your camera sensor's sensitivity to light. The higher number, the more sensitive to light your sensor is going to be. The lower the number, the less sensitive. So maybe you're thinking, well, I'm just going to dial that up as much as I can because I want my sensor to be as sensitive to light as it can be. More light equals better photographs, right? But actually, no. For any given situation, you actually want to keep your ISO as low as you can get away with, because the downsides of higher ISO is that you also get more grain and more noise and weird effects that you'll get in your image too. Let me show you what I mean and how ISO works in my little test shoot here with my Fuji X-T1. Now, ISO capability is a big reason why camera bodies cost different amounts. A cheaper camera might only be able to get about ISO 800 or 1600 before getting really grainy and noisy, whereas a more expensive camera might be able to get to 3200, 6400 and even 10,000 and above and still produce pretty usable images. So in general, in photography and video too for that matter, you pay more to get more light, which is why people get so excited about new cameras with high ISO capabilities, or small cameras with bigger sensors like the 1-inch sensor module co-developed by Leica for the Insta360 1R. Now outside where there's plenty of light, I'll have my ISO set at 100. In the shade, that's more likely to be set at 200. If I'm shooting inside, well then I'll click my ISO up to 400, 800 and even 1600 maybe, depending on the camera. On my X-T1 I can shoot at 1600 or 3200 comfortably, and that can be my go-to setting, depending upon which lens I've got on the camera. I'll come to that soon. So let's recap. ISO is your camera sensor's sensitivity. The higher the number, the more light, but the higher the number, the more noise. So keep your ISO low as you can for the best results. Right, let's talk about aperture. Aperture is the size of the opening in your lens. This one is simple, and if your camera has an adjustable aperture, then you can see it happening. The lens has blades inside that open and close to create a smaller and larger hole. That hole is your aperture. Now here's where it can get a bit confusing, but bear with me. The smaller the number, the bigger the hole, and the more light comes in. The higher the number, the smaller the hole, and the less light comes in. And you'll see this number written in f-stops. You don't have to worry about that right now. Just remember, the smaller the number means more light, the higher the number means less light. So the lens that comes with your camera is often called a kit lens, and it offers a range of apertures. On this lens that I have attached to my X-T1, it ranges from f1.4, which is actually a pretty big hole letting in lots of light, to f16, which is actually a kind of middle of the range hole. You might find your lens has all the way to f32 or even higher, meaning that it doesn't let much light in through that size aperture or hole at all. Higher numbers means less light, lower numbers means more light. Smaller action type cameras or cheaper models don't have an adjustable aperture at all. The size of the hole is fixed. But aperture mainly controls depth of field. Don't worry so much about aperture and how it changes the amount of light it lets into the sensor. It's important, but more important is how we use it. Depth of field is actually really simple. It's how much is in focus in front of and behind the actual spot that you've focused on. So here's where we can make it simple. The smaller the f-stop number, the smaller the depth of field. The higher the f-stop number, the higher or greater the depth of field. Check out this shot here where the point of focus here is on a ruler and you can see the depth of field. The first shot is at f1.4, the second is at f2, then f2.8, f4, f8, f11 and f16. You can see that as the f-stop number went up, the depth of field went up too. So when I'm taking a photo, the first thing I'm going to do is to set my ISO based on the actual scene, outdoors, shade or indoors. The second thing I'm going to do is set my aperture based on my subject and the depth of field I want. If I'm shooting one person for a portrait, I'm going to go low with that depth of field, around about f2 or maybe f2.5. If it's a group of people, then it's maybe more likely to be something like f3.5 to f4, slightly increasing that depth of field. That way I can make sure that everyone who is in that line is in focus, even if they're not standing exactly in line. Now, if I'm shooting landscape where I want the tree in front of me and that mountain in the background to all be in focus at the same time, well, then I'm going to choose f16 or f22, somewhere where everything is going to be in focus and there's going to be nothing blurry. Those super sharp landscape images that you see around the place, they've probably been shot somewhere around f16. So, aperture is the size of the opening in your lens. The lower the f-stop means more light, the higher the f-stop means less light. But remember that aperture controls depth of field, which is way more important when you're creating an image. So low f-stop means a smaller depth of field, higher f-stop means larger depth of field. Got that? Great. Next, last one I'm talking about today is shutter speed. Shutter speed is super simple. Shutter speed is the amount of time measured in seconds your shutter is open. For shutter speed, you'll see numbers like 1/50th of a second, 1/100th of a second, 1/250th of a second, all the way up to 1/8000th of a second, depending upon your camera. It may even be quicker than that. And you can go the other way and you can slow your shutter speed down to 1 second, 2 seconds, 5 seconds, or 10 seconds. Most cameras can go down to 30 seconds, and then you'll need to use something called an intervalometer. A what? Yeah, maybe we'll talk about that another time. While shutter speeds control the amount of time your shutter is open, it also controls motion blur. From a lot of motion blur to where moving objects are totally frozen in time. Super slow shutter speeds are going to be used when you're on a tripod and you're shooting scenes like a landscape or water, like a waterfall or the sea, and you'll want that look where all the water blurs into a really cool motion blurry yummy picture, that kind of thing. And you can always choose all the way to the other side where you want to freeze motion. Here's what's going to help you to get the effect you want. Faster shutter speeds are going to be used when you're shooting things like sports, like where someone is running or shooting a shot or hitting a ball, and you want that crispy still shot where the action is just frozen in place and time. So when I'm shooting portraits, I don't want any motion blur. I want them frozen in place, nice and crispy. So I'll be shooting somewhere between 1/250th and 1/500th of a second. And if my subjects are walking or moving around a little, then I'm going to go a little faster, say 1/800th of a second. Or if there isn't much light and I need to slow down the shutter, then I'll be asking them to keep really still and maybe shoot at 1/100th of a second to get it sharp. For sports, you're going to have to be somewhere in the ballpark of 1/800th or 1/1000th of a second, or even faster than that. So the basics of shutter speed is slower shutter speed equals more motion blur, and faster shutter speed means less motion blur. So let's put all that together and you'll see the kinds of decisions you can make to make sure that you give yourself the best chance of creating fantastic images. So when I'm going to take a shot, the first thing I'm going to do is set my ISO. I'm going to look at my scene and my surroundings. If I'm outdoors and there's plenty of light, then I'm going to bring that ISO right down, maybe 200 or even 100 if I can. Second, I'm going to look at my subject and I'm going to decide how much depth of field do I need for that one person or two people, or maybe a larger group, and I'm going to set my aperture based on that. And third, I'm going to choose how much motion blur I want or don't want and choose my shutter speed based on that. But let's say you've got everything set up and you've got your ISO set and you've chosen your aperture for depth of field and then your shutter speed to match how much motion blur you want, and the image looks too dark. So there's three things you can do to get more light. First thing you can do is slow your shutter speed down. But you can only do that until you start seeing more motion blur in your image. So the second thing to do is to widen your aperture. But you can only do that as much until you don't have enough depth of field and suddenly your subject is out of focus. So the third and final place to find more light is to bump your ISO up. But this is your last resort, because when you do that, you start introducing more grain and noise and other artifacts into your image, which could ruin the whole thing. But if I have to, I will. And depending upon the capabilities of your camera, that's either going to be a big thing, or if you've got a very capable camera, then it might not be much of a big deal at all. The second scenario is the exact opposite. You've dialed everything in, your ISO, your aperture for your right depth of field, and your shutter speed for the right amount of motion blur, and the image looks all blown out. It's far too bright. So the first thing I'm going to do this time is to adjust my ISO, because I've got plenty of light. So I'm going to lower that right down, and as a result get a really nice clean image. If it's still too bright after I've brought my ISO all the way down, then I'll start to raise my shutter speed. And then the last thing to change would be my aperture, because I chose that depth of field for a reason. So I really don't want to change it unless I really have to. Those are your basic foundational elements for making great photos. The triangle of light and how to use that with your camera, no matter what camera you're using. What you've learned just now is the biggest chunk of how to improve your photos to see great results. And now you can troubleshoot what you need to do if you spot a problem in your image too. If you see you don't have enough depth of field, then you know that your aperture needs to go up. If your photo is super noisy, then you know your ISO has to come down. And if there's blur in your images where you don't want it to be, then you know your shutter speed needs to go up. That's how you use the exposure triangle. Hey, subscribe for more like this. Leave comments below too if you've got any questions. I've been nominated for a couple of awards for my photography, so I have a vague idea about what I'm doing. And you never know, I might be able to help you out. Okay, go shoot, show me what you got. I'll see you later.